I don't want no oil a-spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and you have had the wonderful good fortune to tune into For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. We talk about them in the ways that affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and families and the plants and the critters and everything all around you, because we are all together in this one big giant global ecosystem. And much as people like to think they're apart from it, they're not. So we may as well just embrace it and learn what we can about it and just sort of enjoy being part of this amazing web of life. And today is our Easter special. It's our show on April 4th, 2021. And unfortunately, this is a pre-recorded show, so you won't be able to call in. But we've got plenty of cool stuff to talk about anyway. And you can, of course, comment on any of it by sending an email to joe@joedemare4agreenfuture.org. So, this, as I said, we've got a good show coming up. I got a few things to talk about the first little while here. Then hopefully we are going to have an interview with Dr. Timothy Mousseau, and he is the researcher that did the study of Chernobyl that proved once and for all, finally, that the amount of radiation that the animals, specifically the mammals in Chernobyl, absorbed determined how many mammals there were. In other words, finally quieting all those pro-nuclear people that have been claiming that somehow, in some magical way, there was no connection between radiation and the loss of animal diversity, the drop in population. So he right now actually is in Florida on a boat racing to get back to his home port before a huge storm hits. And he's sent me an email this morning and says if he makes it, then I should be able to interview him this afternoon. And, of course, I'll add that interview in. Then we hear from our terrific sponsors. Rebecca Wood will be joining us. In fact, I've already recorded her contribution to today's show. She has some advice for those of you that are thinking of celebrating the Easter season by perhaps buying some chicks or some bunnies. And she's talking to somebody who's actually done that. And she came up with some interesting things for us to know about that. Then, of course, there's environmental news, ecological news, and there's quite a bit of it. Man, there's a ton of stuff been happening in this past week. And Nature had a little April Fool's joke for us this morning also. We had a bit of a snow flurry there this morning, and so it may be that my wife was right, that we shouldn't have planted the peas back when we did on the first day of spring. But to my, on my side of it, March 2021, it turned out, has been a record warm March. And in fact, we had something like in Northwest Ohio, 4 record hot days for March in that 1 month. So, and my solar panels put out an incredible amount of power in March. In fact, over 800 kilowatt hours, the highest we've had since we turned them on. So, I wasn't without reason in deciding to plant our peas early, and in fact, they may still turn out. So we're going to have to wait and see. One thing that is turning out as hoped this year is the walleye run. As you may recall, back last 2 weeks ago, we had an interview with the ODNR biologist, Eric Weimer, and he said that this is a record. We've had some record walleye hatches, and I went down to Maumee Tackle, which is sort of the unofficial capital of the walleye run for the Maumee River. They're not paying me to say this or anything, but traditionally, being so close to the Maumee, people go there, and went and got my fishing license, and I was watching some of the fishermen, and people had set up in the parking lot to do fish cleaning. So if you want to catch the fish but you don't want to worry about cleaning them yourself, there's some couple of people set up there with tents, and I was just watching them for a while, and they're just amazing at how quickly they can clean the fish and how much they can get off of it. And it's, I saw a lot of fishermen with their full stringer, because the limit is 6 fish per day right now. And it was really kind of a cool thing. I mean, when we take care of nature, when we allow species to have enough for themselves, there's a lot left over for the rest of us. And I think that got brought home watching these fishermen who had these huge stringers of fish, and it was just really cool. So I bought my license, and I'm going to get out there, but I'm going to wait till it gets a little bit warmer, I think. On a day when it's snowing, I don't think I'm going to be going out fishing. And fishing kind of brought me around to a show I watched last night. David Attenborough has created another show for PBS, another documentary, and this one was entitled Extinction: The Facts. And it's kind of a potent mix of really depressing news about how badly the natural ecosystems, the global biosphere, is in the state of collapse. But it being David Attenborough, it was also mixed with optimism. It was mixed with the idea that we can still turn it around. We have a couple years here. We don't have 10 years. Nope. We don't have 20. No. But we do have a few years here where we can make the big shifts and the big changes in the way we treat nature, and nature will rebound. And one of the things they were talking about was fishing, of course, and they were talking about how in a lot of the ocean, the ocean has been turned into a desert. All the fish have been taken, like especially off in some places off the coast of Britain and so forth, where they gave examples that there's seine netting going on that literally takes everything. But that reminded me of the Norwegian fishery, which is being fished sustainably. And they, based on science, have found that if they leave 90% of the fish untouched or unharvested, then they can take that remaining 10% indefinitely. And that 10% is still millions of tons of fish. So all it takes is delaying, leaving a little bit, and in the end, you end up with more, because you can take that 10% every year forever. Whereas if you cross that line, if you take more than that, 1 or 2 years you can harvest a lot of fish, but then the populations crash, and then you get no fish. So there were some other things they were talking about in the show worth noting, and that is that our friend the pangolin, we've talked about pangolins before, about how they were the vector that at the wet markets in Asia that gave us COVID. Probably the virus jumped from bats to pangolins to humans. But there's a tremendous, an insane level of poaching and pressure on the pangolins all through Asia and Africa. And in fact, in 2019, they seized 100 tons of pangolin scales, which translates to hundreds of thousands of pangolins that were taken, and their scales are used as a marketing ploy in Asian medicine. But really the scales are sort of just super fingernails. They're made of literally the same stuff as your fingernails. So there really is no medicinal benefit to grinding up and eating pangolin scales, but it's been promoted that way, and now the pangolins are well on their way to extinction. And one other statistic from that documentary that caught my attention is that right now biomass on the planet in terms of animals, just if you took all the animals on the planet and weighed them, put them on scales, it turns out that livestock, our cows and our sheep and our goats and our pigs, livestock right now is 60% of the biomass on planet Earth. In other words, there's more livestock than anything else on the planet. And humans, actually, we are only account for 36% of the biomass of the planet. So, in other words, we're raising so much livestock that it's just insane. There's more livestock than us right now. And so we got livestock at 60, we got humans at 36. That leaves 4% for everything else. That's, all the elephants, all the bison, all the caribou. Add all that other biomass up, and it's only 4% of the biomass on the planet. This is clearly unsustainable. This is clearly a system on its way to collapsing, because to maintain all that livestock, we have to grow the crops to feed the livestock. And something like 90% of the crops we grow goes to feeding livestock. So, we need to start reducing the amount of meat in our diet. It's just that simple. We cannot all have meat every meal. And the ironic thing, of course, is it's not even healthy for all of us to have meat every meal. I just found out that someone I know has fatty liver disease. And one of the causes of fatty liver disease is a diet high in fatty meat. If you eat enough fatty meat, you can get fatty liver disease. So it's not good for us. It's literally killing the planet. And it's just, we need to take that 4% of the biomass, the 4% of wild animals that are left, and we need to give them some of that stuff we've got set aside for livestock. It's just insane what we're doing. But again, as David Attenborough says, it's not too late. We can still pull this out. We can still save the planet and ourselves, I may add, because if the global ecosystem collapses, if the global biosphere collapses, we will not be far behind. We've had some inklings this past year in 2020 of just how fragile all these systems that we created are. So let's hope we heed that warning and change our habits before the things actually collapse irretrievably. So that was talking about David Attenborough's Extinction: The Facts documentary, and you can find that on PBS if you go to their website and look for things you can download. Okay, so now speaking of quote-unquote livestock. One thing that often happens at Easter time is people give the gifts of chicks and bunnies, maybe to the little kids that they know. Rebecca Wood has something to say about that, so let's go talk to her right now. Okay, Rebecca, let me be the first to say Happy Easter to you. And
Thank you, and same to you.
Thank you, and I'm pretty confident I am the first since we're recording this on the Wednesday before. But
you are the first.
Yeah, there you go. So you've been doing a little research. What do you have for us this week?
I have. Well, I spoke to urban farmer Liz Mo Dickens about raising rabbits and chickens, just in case somebody gets gifted one of those things or makes a not good decision and goes and buys one, not knowing how much of a commitment they are. I'm about to tell you.
Okay. Now, is this the woman who has the goats and chickens there right on Collingwood Avenue?
No, she's in another neighborhood, I believe. But yeah, there's a number of people around who, I think, Liz is more kind of in West Toledo.
So it's becoming a thing in West Toledo for some people to raise some livestock. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Liz has had rabbits as a child, and she showed them at the 4-H club. Apparently, she got interested in having them as therapy animals because they apparently, quote, "There's something magical about how people react to the calm behavior of a rabbit." So this would be rabbits when they're not, running around and jumping and kicking and things.
Right.
Although they're kind of fun in their own way when they are, playing and things. She's had a lot of different individuals and different breeds of rabbits over the years. She currently has a lion-headed mixes and an English Angora, which in particular has a great personality, but grooming is expensive and time-consuming because, they're bred for their fur, so they have a lot of fur. She says that rabbits are emotionally sensitive and develop strong bonds with people. They like to interact a lot. They can be litter trained, and they can learn simple tricks, and they really love toys, but they can be very destructive if you don't have the right environment for them and you don't keep them busy. They need more space than a hutch, usually. Heat can kill them, so they do best as indoor pets. So basically, they need a regular daily routine of clean water, food, clean bedding, and interaction or enrichment, which he calls enrichment, making their lives more interesting with, hiding their food or playing games with them or something. I think she takes hers out with her when she feeds the chicken every day in the yard. She takes the dogs and the rabbit, and they all have a little excursion to see the chickens every day. But I did not know this. Rabbits need to be spayed or neutered to not become destructive. Because apparently they have a really bad adolescent phrase if you're not careful.
Uh-huh. I did not know that either. Of course, I didn't know they could be litter trained, so I'm learning a lot here.
Yeah, they can be killed by rough handling. They often prefer to be sat next to by a person rather than picked up.
Well,
because, picking them up kind of reminds them of hawks and eagles swooping down and grabbing them, which is something you want to avoid if you are a prey animal.
Right.
The medical care for both those and chickens is expensive because they're classified as exotic animals. And you got to be careful and introduce them carefully if you get a new one because they can fight and bite each other. And also, Liz comments, people forget that they have needs because they can't complain. Because really, rabbits don't make noise unless something is actually killing them, which you don't want to hear. So I've actually, this is a little weird, but I used to think that rabbits were sort of timid and boring, but then I was in a house with one once, and it followed me into the bathroom and insisted on going to the bathroom in its litter box at the same time to make the point that we were special friends, I guess.
Wow.
And then I used to sit, it was a bonding thing, I don't know. Also, I used to sit for my next-door neighbor's rabbit, who I would sort of squat down to get its snacks out of the refrigerator, and it would circle around and headbutt me in the rear end.
As a side
Every time I tried to do this, your sort of your center of gravity is low enough, you're very surprised, and you might fall over almost. I nearly did, actually.
Is that considered a sign of affection amongst rabbits, headbutting?
I don't know. I think he was sassing me, is what it is. They have to feel really. I've always sort of thought kitties and puppies were more interesting, but rabbits have more kind of a subtle personality. They have to be more comfortable with you before they will clown around, and then it comes out, I think.
Uh-huh.
But let's see, chickens terms, Liz has had bantam chickens for 3 years. Her favorite breeds are Ducle, I don't know how to say that, D''UCCLE, and the Polish chickens. She says they're like owning miniature dinosaurs and describes them as fun and fascinating. They also need more space than people realize. And to have a safe outdoor coop, they need a safe outdoor coop that's draft-free and predator-proof. And little known fact, I did not know this, chicken wire only keeps chickens in. It does not keep predators out. So you have to have something called hardware cloth. Which makes sense because I remember reading in Farley Mowat's Owls in the Family that they tried making a chicken wire cage for the owls, and it turns out they can just sort of just swipe right through it like tissue paper. So it's not going to protect your bunnies from owls, clearly. Also, huge vet bills, exotic animals. And if you get a chick, they have to be kept really, really warm, so you want to use an EcoGlow brooder. Heat lamps are good, but they can cause fires. So EcoGlow brooder is best, apparently.
So if someone just gives you a bunch of chicks without the necessary equipment, then if you want them to survive, you're going to have to take a quick run out to the hardware store, it sounds like.
Yeah, you are, and there's, special equipment, and you got to buy feed, and you got to have the right environment for them, and it's all pretty, and, they want attention, too, especially bunnies. They're social critters. They want attention, so it's not good to just leave them in their hutch.
Right.
So, I mean, Liz apparently finds it very rewarding, but it's some work. It's some money, and it's some work and time.
Gotcha. So if you're thinking of giving somebody this year some chicks or some bunnies for Easter, it's you should actually think a couple times about it. Think carefully about it.
Yeah, maybe even 3 or 4.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And now it's time to hear from our wonderful sponsors and patrons. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways to get a hold of them. One is to call at 419-353-1897. You can also go to their website, wcparks.org, and they have a nifty app that you can download from any app store. Just search for WC Parks. And of course, they're available on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and all the other social media. For Green Future is also brought to you by our wonderful patrons who've gone to patreon.com and chosen a monthly amount that fits their budget. So, always nice to hear from Rebecca. Now, we're going to go on to our ecological news segment because our hoped-for guest is racing up the coast of Florida trying to make it back to port before his boat gets hit by a storm. Let's hope he succeeds in that, and we can have him on a little later. But right now, there's a lot of environmental news to talk about. First story I want to talk about, the story actually began on February 3rd. And I didn't report on that at that time because there's just so much to report on. But a nuclear reactor, a research reactor in Maryland, which is on the campus of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, had an quote-unquote incident. In other words, it had an accident. It had a nuclear accident. And they have, the reason I'm bringing it up right now is because this past week, they just admitted that the amount of radiation was 3 times what they initially estimated. And the reason I wanted to bring this up, the reason I wanted to say this was so important, is because this always happens 100% of the time. Whenever there's a nuclear accident, they initially downplay the amount of radiation released and the amount of danger that that radiation poses. And there's a tremendous, huge lie, big, bald, up front, in your face, 100% false lie on all these stories covering it. And that is that they say that their radiation posed no danger to the public. I think NRC employees get that tattooed on their arm when they get hired, because that's what they always say. No matter how much radiation there is, they always say there's no danger to the public, when in fact, in truth, every bit of radiation is a danger to the public. As we know, as we've talked about before, the linear no threshold model has been proven over and over again that any amount of radiation increase causes an increase in disease, in cancer, in health effects. And so when they say it's a safe level, when they say A, they're lying, but B, what that word safe means to them means that the public is going to have to suffer sacrifice, is going to have to suffer disease and death at a rate that's acceptable to them. That's what they call safe. So this accident that happened on February 3rd was so serious that they actually evacuated the control room. They told all the workers to get out, and a number of the workers were contaminated with radioactivity. And so that should have raised enough flags, that should have raised the warning bells. I probably should have reported on this one back in February, but it was a relatively small reactor. And, even though I know better, when they said in all the news releases that this was very minor radiation release and no danger to the public, I was thinking small reactor, or not a Chernobyl level thing or a 3 Mile Island level thing. I let it slide, but part of the information that has come out this past week is that there was actual damage to the fuel rods. And damage to the fuel rods means a nuclear plant is on its way to a meltdown. And so they're not specific. They haven't given any specifics on what that damage was or how bad it is. But if history is any guide, if they're admitting this soon out that there's damage to the fuel rods, that damage was probably pretty significant. And the reactor shut down indefinitely. And let's pray that it never starts up again, because even a research reactor, if it has a meltdown, can cause an area to be uninhabitable for hundreds of thousands of years. And this reactor happens to be right in the heart of Gaithersburg, Maryland. There's people literally right next to this facility. There's no evacuation zone in terms of getting people out in time, because it's so densely populated. If this reactor started to go, you just couldn't get enough people, out of the way in time for them to avoid getting possibly catastrophic radiation exposures. So this turns out to be a much more serious accident than it first appeared. Turns out the people that run the reactor and the NRC were lying when they talked about the amount of radiation released. And the fact that they tripled their estimate just a month later, to me, says that we're going to see some more tripling and quadrupling, and it's going to turn out that this accident was much more serious than they made out to be. And when they say it was perfectly safe for the public, they are lying. And so just remember that if you ever hear of a nuclear incident that's starting somewhere near you, let's say near Davis-Besse or near Perry, don't wait. Leave. That's my advice. Don't wait around for them to say, oh, you know what, it is dangerous. Start evacuating, because historically, evacuations have always started after people got exposed to massive amounts of radiation. So a little news out of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's really disappointing that the people at the National Institute of standards and technology have a standard that says any amount of radiation is acceptable. The standard should be 0 additional radiation. And the fact that those people in that government agency are saying, well, we can irradiate you some, that is very, very worrisome. All right, something else that's a little worrisome. Story in phys.org. Turns out flowers are blooming early. And this has caused problems for insects because insects time things like when they hatch and when they come out of hibernation to match when there's food available. And what's happening is that because it's been getting so much warmer, what used to happen is you would get this progression of flowers. You'd get the ones that were very tolerant to the cold and snow. They'd come first, like the snowdrops, for example. And then, there'd be this succession of flowers that each was a little better or worse able to handle the cold. And so the insects would have this string of different kinds of foods for pollen and for nectar. Well, now that winter is being pushed back, or the start of spring is earlier and earlier, all these flowers are kind of piling up. They're blooming earlier, and so you have the snowdrops at the same time as the crocuses and maybe even coming along with some of the earlier blooming dandelions. And that is causing problems because there's this huge rush of flowers right at the beginning. And so the insects that feed on pollen are going just willy-nilly from flower to flower, and they are not carrying the same pollen to the same species of flower, which is what you need to get pollination. In other words, if snowdrops are the only flower blooming at the early part of the winter, and the bees say, aha, snowdrops, they go around and they get the nectar from all the snowdrops. At the same time, they pollinate all the snowdrops. But if the snowdrops are there next to the crocuses, next to the dandelions, and the bees just go from one species to the next, interspecies pollen, then then they might be bringing dandelion pollen into the snowdrops, and that does none of the flowers any good. So it's affecting reproduction rate of wildflowers. The fact that all the flowers are piling up in the early part of the year. The snowdrops aren't blooming any earlier, but then the other flowers are, and so you get this big rush of flowers way early, and then you get a dearth of flowers because they've already had their blooming, and it's not linking up with when the insects are starting to come out of hibernation or hatching from their eggs, and it's just another thing that's going wrong. Just another wrench thrown in the works. Okay, so now House Bill 6 update. This one's a little bit more positive. We reported last week that House Bill 128 had been passed by the Ohio House and Senate, and that the governor was being coy about when he was going to sign it because, I don't know, maybe he had to do some more negotiating with Energy Harbor or something. Who knows why he delayed. But he has finally signed it. It is now law. And what it does is it eliminates the charge on the bills that would have gone to the nuclear power plants, to Davis-Besse and Perry. And the reason they did that is because Energy Harbor asked them to, because of changes in federal regulations where getting that subsidy would have actually cost them money in the long run. But there is one additional thing I want to say about that. It does turn out to be a little bit better than I had reported last week, because this bill actually does two things, not just the one thing. It does get rid of the subsidy, but it also gets rid of what's called decoupling. And we've reported on this before. Decoupling basically means that you have to subsidize your neighbor who wastes energy, because the way it works is it decouples the amount of power from your power bill. So instead of being charged by the kilowatt hour, how much you actually use, they just lump everybody together and average it out and charge everybody the same, regardless of how much or how little they use. And that has been shown over and over again that leads to waste, because if people's electric bills aren't affected by the amount of power they use, why not leave the front door open? In the middle of the winter, if you got electric heating, you just crank it up, and it doesn't cost you anything. So they did get rid of decoupling, but still, there's a lot of terrible stuff from House Bill 6, which is being allowed to stand. But House Bill 128 was a little bit better than we had reported on. So Dr. Mousseau did, in fact, make it into port. And so let's just go to that interview right now.
Okay.
Could you please give us your name and your position?
My name's Tim Mousseau, and I'm a professor of biological sciences at the University of South Carolina.
Okay. And I've been wanting to interview you for our show since last August, when you published an article with the somewhat unwieldy title, Dose Reconstruction Supports the Interpretation of Decreased Abundance of Mammals in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. And I saw that in the Journal of Scientific Reports. But before we dive into the article itself, could you give our listeners a little background, like what happens inside the body of an animal that absorbs a radioactive atom like cesium or strontium?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, as they say. There's a lot of sort of random interactions between the radiation and the biological materials. And so, again, depending upon just how radioactive the source is, will determine the probability of an encounter between a photon of energy from, say, a gamma radiation source, or an electron, or a helium nucleus, again, depending on whether it's a beta particle or an alpha particle. And if one of these particles hits some of the DNA, it can burst, break a hole on the DNA. If it hits the cell membrane, it can do some damage to that. The gamma radiation probably does a lot of damage via creating free radicals, oxygen-free radicals inside the cells when it interacts with the water molecules, and it's these reactive oxygen species, as they say, that actually causes the damage to cellular apparatus like DNA and other things. So it's particularly dangerous when the radioactivity is inside the body and inside the cells, but it's also dangerous, especially if it's a gamma source, when the radiation is coming from external sources as well, like when you walk around in the red forest of Chernobyl, for instance.
Yeah. So now you're not exactly a newcomer to this field of study, are you? As I understand it, you've been researching the effects of radioactive contamination for over 20 years. Could you summarize some of your earlier studies and some of the things you and your team have found?
My colleagues and I have been studying the effects of radiation in Chernobyl for about, I guess this is year 21 for me. And
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, we're hoping. We actually missed this past year because of the COVID pandemic, and this is, although some of our colleagues in Ukraine have been continuing some of the basic work, but obviously I did not make it back last summer. We're hoping, now that everyone's been vaccinated, or a lot of people have been vaccinated, we're hoping to get back there this June to continue our field studies of the birds in particular. But still, it's still up in the air at this point in time. We'll see. In terms of things that we've that we've reported on over the past few years, it's quite a potpourri of findings. The first paper we published as a team was in 2001 in the journal Evolution, where we documented that some of the birds, especially the birds in the more radioactive areas, were showing signs of white feathers. They had these white patches on their plumage, and was more likely to show up in these more radioactive areas. It seems, this seems kind of benign, but it's correlated to lower survival and lower probability of surviving from one year to the next. And so it's certainly linked to something that has a fitness consequence. But that was the first sort of observation. A couple of years later, after trapping a few more birds and looking at them, we commented on the fact that many characters of relevance to the survival and reproduction of these organisms were more likely to show what appeared to be the effects of mutations. They were more variable in the more radioactive areas. And this, again, came as a bit of a surprise. We then started discovering all sorts of interesting things like genetic damage. We also discovered cataract in the eyes, which is a well-known consequence of radiation exposure. We recorded smaller brains in the birds of the more radioactive areas, and again, neurological impairment is not an uncommon consequence of radiation exposure in other organisms. So this wasn't totally surprising, but it had never been documented for critters in the Chernobyl area. One of the more surprising observations for us was that the male gametes, the sperm, were dramatically impacted by the radiation, and about up to 40% of birds in a given year in the more radioactive areas were completely sterile. And so,
wow.
Again, this kind of spoke to why, we felt this probably had something to do with the fact that there were many fewer birds overall and lower diversity of birds in the more radioactive areas, and it could have been, in part the result of this lower fertility as well. Again, I could go on and on. We've published
yeah.
about 110, 120 papers most in the last 15 years, and going on mice and on plants and on bacteria and birds, and basically the bottom line has been that every system we bother to look at, we find some signature of the effects of radiation, and usually the effects are negative.
Yeah, I'm afraid we don't have time to go for all those studies. So I guess let's focus back in on the one that was published last August. So is it an accurate way to sort of sum up that title be as radiation increases, mammals decrease?
Yes. So that particular paper that came out just last year was a reanalysis of a paper that we'd written a few years earlier, where we basically ran around the Chernobyl zone in the wintertime, and waited for a fresh snowfall, and then we walked transects and counted the footprints and identified the species of animal that had created these footprints all throughout the Chernobyl zone. And the first analysis that we did simply related sort of the frequency or the abundance and the diversity of mammals living in a given area. And we found that there was a very good relationship, that in more radioactive areas there were fewer mammals, and the diversity of mammals was lower as well. Although not all species showed the same pattern. Some species, like wolves, for instance, were not related to the radiation, in part because there were so few wolves. It was hard to do anything sort of statistically rigorous, but also wolves have such large territory sizes that again, one probably wouldn't expect them to show up as being related to radiation effects, just because of the way the contamination is distributed across the zone in a very patchy way. And so it's mostly the organisms that don't move quite as much that show this relationship. Again, no big surprise. This new paper, though, the there was a fairly sizable backlash to that paper, in that a lot of people just didn't believe it because they heard these anecdotal reports about the mammals thriving in the Chernobyl zone. Many people had seen National Geographic specials where the wolves are being videotaped, and where there are moose and deer and wild boar, and that's all true. What is not true is that it is universally the case across the zone that the mammals have increased in numbers. What we've found is that yes, there are these mammals inside the Chernobyl zone, but the numbers are much lower in the radioactive areas in general. What this reanalysis did was to put this whole study in the framework of dose, predicted radiation dose to individual animals, and so provided a much more rigorous radio-ecological analysis than had been done in the past, and kind of validated our original study with much greater rigor. So we were quite happy to team up with this group from France that specializes in this kind of analysis, and to basically get the same result.
I see. So yeah, the nuclear proponents sort of paint the Chernobyl zone as virtually Eden there, with the wildlife left to sort of thrive. But I mean, this study shows that it's not that simple. That the patches, the more radioactive parts of this area are actually void or have much less mammalian life. Have you had any sort of personal, direct experiences with the wild animals that sort of illustrate that they're having problems with the radiation? I know you've seen birds with white patches on them, and have reported on that. Are there any other sort of direct observational things that you've seen in the Chernobyl zone that kind of made you wonder?
Yeah, we've done quite a few direct observations of many different groups, especially the birds, but also the plants and the mammals. We've documented consequences to the mammals, both in terms of sort of simple abundances, but also we've done experiments with some of the smaller mammals, the rodents, in collaboration with our colleagues in Finland, Tapio Mapes in particular. His group has been working with us for the last 7 or 8 years now, where we have been counting and manipulating, experimenting with these small rodents, these voles that have been a favorite study organism for radioecologists in Chernobyl because they're relatively abundant. And with these voles, we've also found, just like with the birds, we found smaller brains. We've found increased frequencies of cataract in the eyes. We've also found fertility problems, especially in the females, but also some indication of fertility problems in the males, and dramatically lower numbers of these organisms in the more radioactive areas. So paralleling the observations that we've made with the birds as well, we have a recent study, I think, that is coming out fairly soon. It may not be out just yet, but it looks at 4 different species of mice, 2 species in Chernobyl, 2 species in Fukushima, and it looks at their microbiome. Microbiome have been a favorite topic of discussion recently because of the interactions between the gut microflora and the health of the host for humans in particular.
So those that you're talking about, the bacteria that live inside the digestive system of these animals.
Exactly.
Right.
We all have a superabundance of bacteria living inside our bodies, and they help with digestion. They help with facilitation of micronutrient availability. They help with our immune system. The list goes on and on. They probably do an extremely wide range of things that we have no idea what it is at this point. But there's a lot of interest in the microbiome, and so we've actually done a fair bit of work with the microbiome of these rodents, the voles and now the mice, and it's very clear that the radioactivity is dramatically impacting the microbiome community in the guts of these organisms. We just started a new project a couple of years ago with the wild dogs of Chernobyl. This another mammal system. The dogs that presumably were the descendants of the animals that were left by the folks who were forced to evacuate right after the accident. And the dog populations go up and down, but they had been quite large as a result of all the increase in tourism in the zone. And so in collaboration with an NGO called CFF and a team of volunteer veterinarians and vet techs and others, we conducted spay-neuter clinics for the wild dogs, and at the same time took samples of their DNA and the microbiome. And we now are working with the National Institutes of Health to do whole genome sequencing of these animals, and we're working with Qiagen, which is a world leading biotech company out of Germany that supplies a lot of labs, molecular labs, with supplies. They're helping us to look at the microbiome in these dogs as well. And so, again, we have lots and lots of direct studies of the mammals as well, and they're all pointing to the same general conclusion, which is it's not really a good idea to be living in a radioactive environment, especially to be spending your whole life there.
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe we could say that radiation is sort of inimical to life itself of all sorts. It sounds like down to the bacteria and up to the wolves and the people.
Yeah, well, it's clear that radiation, ionizing radiation of the sort that we're talking about, starting at ultraviolet and going up from there, and then of course heavy ions flying through space at incredibly rapid paces. All of this radiation is damaging for any organism. Some organisms are better able to deal with it by either protecting their vital bits like the DNA, going into some form of dormancy. But one of the hypotheses with respect to life on this planet has been that it really wasn't until we had a good ozone layer in the atmosphere to protect us from UV that life really came out onto the surface of land. Prior to then, it had only been in marine systems and aquatic systems, and in part because of the shielding that water provides against radiation. That's one of the hypotheses for why life took so long to appear on the surface of the planet, and certainly it does make a lot of sense. There's been suggestions that maybe life is adapted to radiation because of this long evolutionary history, but there really is very no good evidence that this is generally the case. There may be some specific examples, like I said before, where organisms are tolerant. Some organisms are more tolerant of it than others, but there are no clear examples of organisms that do well under conditions of enhanced radioactivity, and so it's really rather silly when people make such suggestions, and invariably folks that do have some other agenda, and so one has to be suspicious.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I do run into those folks a fair bit on the internet. But I understand you recently gave a talk to some scientists at NASA. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you told them, or?
Yeah, actually, I was a couple of years ago. I got a call from some folks at NASA to get involved with them on a project they were doing to study the effects of radiation on plants. There's a group at NASA. Well, NASA's very interested in radiation because space has lots of radiation. When you travel in space, you get a huge dose, And there's a great interest in returning to the moon in the next few years, and of course everyone wants to go to Mars now, and they want to send people to Mars. And if they're going to send people to Mars, they're also going to have to send plants to grow so that the people can feed themselves. But the problem, one of the challenges is that this is an extremely radioactive environment, and so anything that goes will have to be shielded or be very tolerant to radiation effects. So anyway, some of the folks thought that some of the work we were doing in Chernobyl might be relevant for the space mission. And so we've been collaborating to look at how radiation of various types of radiation, especially cosmic-like radiation, these heavy ions of different atoms flying at near the speed of light, how they might affect living systems, especially plants. And we've been collaborating, taking seeds from Chernobyl, and so we've been collaborating. I've been collaborating with folks at NASA to determine whether or not some of these Chernobyl plants have increased tolerance of radiation, and thus might have some adaptive genetic variation that might be useful for the space mission, in terms of perhaps, transferring genes into, cultivars that can be grown to feed astronauts along the voyage to Mars. And so, this has been very exciting for me. So far I can't say I'm very optimistic of finding a simple solution to this problem, but I'm willing to give it a try.
Well, I wish you luck in that collaboration there. So, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything that we haven't covered yet?
No, I think that's the latest update from the Chernobyl and Fukushima Research Initiative here at the University of South Carolina, and we just hope that we can get back to the field this year and continue our ongoing studies. We've been, the barn swallows of Chernobyl. We've studied for over 20 years in a row now, except for last year. So hopefully we can get back on track and continue this long-term data collection. That's really what is needed in order to address some of these important questions.
And that'll do it for this episode. Happy Easter. This is Joe DeMare signing off. I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!